I walked up the courthouse steps that Tuesday morning, clutching 3 worn manila folders against my chest, wearing the same navy blue suit I had bought for my college graduation 6 years ago. The fabric was slightly wrinkled, and the shoes needed polishing, but it was all I had. My parents, David and Linda, were already there with my older brother Marcus, standing beside their expensive attorney, Mr. Richardson, in his $1,000 suit. When my mother saw me approaching, she shook her head and whispered just loud enough for the small crowd of family friends to hear, "You have never been good with money, Joe." My father rolled his eyes as I walked past them toward the entrance. I felt every judgmental stare burning into my back, but I squared my shoulders and kept walking, knowing that today everything would change. The courtroom felt like a cathedral of judgment as I entered. The high ceilings and dark wood paneling seemed to press down on me as I made my way to the defendant's table. Judge Patricia Hendricks, a woman in her 50s with silver hair, pulled back in a tight bun, presided from her elevated bench with the kind of authority that comes from decades of making life-changing decisions. My family occupied the entire front row behind the plaintiff's table, flanked by their supporters. Uncle Robert sat with his arms crossed, shaking his head disapprovingly. Family friend Mrs. Patterson whispered something to my Aunt Sarah, both women shooting me looks of pity mixed with disgust. My parents had clearly done their work building a coalition against me. Mr. Richardson stood and addressed the court with the confidence of a man who had never lost a case like this. His voice carried across the courtroom as he laid out their argument with surgical precision. "Your Honor, we are here today because Joseph Mitchell Anderson cannot be trusted with his inheritance. 6 months ago, he was fired from his position at Williams and Associates, a reputable accounting firm where he had worked for 3 years. Since then, he has been unemployed, living off credit cards and borrowing money from friends. His credit score has plummeted to 420, and he currently owes over $18,000 in various debts." Richardson moved to an easel where he had prepared charts and graphs detailing my financial situation. Each number felt like a physical blow as he read them aloud. The deceased grandmother, Sarah Anderson, left a trust fund worth $1.4 million to Mr. Anderson when she passed 2 years ago. However, the trust cannot be accessed until he turns 30, unless this court determines he is financially responsible enough to manage it earlier, or conversely, if this court determines he needs a conservator to protect the assets from mismanagement. He gestured toward my parents. Mr. David Anderson and Mrs. Linda Anderson, along with their elder son Marcus Anderson, are petitioning this court for a conservatorship over Joseph's inheritance. They have provided sworn statements detailing his poor judgment, his inability to hold steady employment, and his reckless spending habits. I watched as Richardson pulled out document after document. Bank statements showing my overdrawn accounts, credit card bills with minimum payments missed, the termination letter from Williams and Associates, my rental agreement showing I was 3 months behind on rent. Each piece of evidence felt like another nail in my coffin. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as Richardson continued. "This family loves Joseph deeply. Your Honor, but love sometimes means making difficult decisions to protect someone from themselves. Mrs. Anderson will testify that just last month Joseph asked her for $500 to pay his electric bill money, which she provided out of maternal concern, only to discover he had used it to purchase a new gaming console." I felt my face flush with anger at the distortion of that story, but I remained seated. My time would come. The family is requesting that David Anderson be appointed as conservator with Linda Anderson, as co-conservator to ensure that Joseph's inheritance is preserved and used for his genuine needs rather than squandered on impulsive purchases and poor financial decisions. Richardson returned to his seat with a satisfied expression. Judge Hendricks turned her attention to me. "Mr. Anderson, I understand you wish to represent yourself in this matter." I stood, feeling every eye in the courtroom boring into me. My 3 folders suddenly felt insignificant against Richardson's briefcase full of evidence and legal documents. Yes, Your Honor, I will be representing myself. Do you have legal training, Mr. Anderson? This was the moment I had been preparing for. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. Your Honor, 3 weeks ago I passed the bar examination in the state of Pennsylvania. I am licensed to practice law. The courtroom erupted in whispers. I heard my brother Marcus's sharp intake of breath from the front row. When I turned slightly, I could see his face had gone completely pale. Objection. Your Honor. Richardson jumped to his feet. This is clearly a desperate ploy. Mr. Anderson has never attended law school. There is no way he could have legitimately passed any bar examination. Judge Hendricks held up her hand for silence. Mr. Anderson, do you have documentation proving your claim? I opened my first folder and withdrew a certified copy of my bar examination results, along with my temporary license to practice law. I approached the bench and handed them to the bailiff. Judge Hendricks examined the documents carefully, her eyebrows rising slightly. After what felt like an eternity, she looked up at me. These appeared to be legitimate. Mr. Richardson, Pennsylvania, allows bar examination candidates without traditional law school education under specific circumstances. Mr. Anderson's documentation is in order. The whispers grew louder. I could hear my mother's voice rising above the others. That is impossible. He never told us anything about studying law. Mr. Anderson, Judge Hendricks continued, you may proceed with your opening statement. I returned to my table and opened my second folder. Inside were months of research legal precedents and carefully prepared arguments. As I stood to address the court, I caught my father's eye. For the first time since I'd entered the courtroom, he was not rolling his eyes. Instead, he was staring at me with something that looked almost like fear. The real battle was about to begin. I approached the center of the courtroom, and for the first time in months I felt completely in control. This was my moment to tell the truth that my family had been working so hard to bury. Your Honor, everything Mr. Richardson has told you about my recent financial struggles is accurate. I was indeed fired from Williams & Associates 6 months ago. I do owe money on credit cards. I am behind on rent. But the story behind these facts is not what my family has presented to this court. I opened my second folder and pulled out a thick stack of documents. When I lost my job at Williams & Associates, it was not due to incompetence or poor performance. I was terminated because I discovered that senior partners at the firm were manipulating client accounts and engaging in fraudulent billing practices. I reported these irregularities to the State Board of Accountancy and was subsequently fired in retaliation. I handed copies of my whistleblower complaint to the bailiff for the judge's review. Rather than seek immediate employment elsewhere, I made a conscious decision to use this difficult period in my life for something productive. I spent every day for 6 months studying law, using online resources, correspondence courses, and night classes at Philadelphia Community College. Pennsylvania is one of 4 states that allow candidates to take the bar examination through supervised legal education rather than traditional law school. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the family members who had been whispering among themselves were hanging on every word. I studied constitutional law, civil procedure contracts, torts, criminal law, and property law for 12 to 14 hours every day. I lived off my savings, and yes, I accumulated debt doing so because I was investing in my future, rather than taking the first minimum wage job I could find. I could see my parents exchanging worried glances. This was not the narrative they had expected me to present. But that brings me to the real issue before this court today, Your Honor. This conservatorship petition is not actually about my financial responsibility. It is about money, but not in the way Mr. Richardson has presented. I moved to my third folder and pulled out financial documents that I had spent weeks gathering. My grandmother's will contains a specific clause that my family has chosen not to mention. If the trust fund is determined by this court to be mismanaged, or if the beneficiary is found to be permanently incompetent, the money does not revert to the family. Instead, it goes to the American Red Cross Disaster Relief Fund. The effect of this revelation was immediate. My father's face went red, and my mother gripped the edge of the bench in front of her. "Your Honor, I have here bank statements and financial records that tell a very different story than the one we have heard today." I approached the bench again with a stack of documents. These records show that my parents are facing significant financial difficulties of their own. My father's restaurant, Anderson's Family Diner, has been losing money for 18 months. They have borrowed against their home equity twice in the past year. Their credit card debt exceeds $32,000. My brother Marcus, despite his position at Henderson Clark and Associates, owes over $60,000 in student loans from law school and has been denied for a mortgage twice due to his debt-to-income ratio. I turned to face my family directly. The truth is that my family needs access to my grandmother's trust fund to solve their own financial problems. They have convinced themselves that because the money originally came from my father's mother, they have some moral claim to it. But Grandma Sarah chose me as the beneficiary for specific reasons which I will now explain. I returned to my documents and pulled out a letter written in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. This is a letter my grandmother wrote to me 6 months before she died. She never sent it, but I found it among her personal effects when we cleaned out her house. In this letter, she explains her decision to leave the trust fund to me rather than to her children. Judge Hendricks leaned forward with interest. "Please read the relevant portions, Mr. Anderson." I cleared my throat and began to read. "Dear Joe, I know this decision will be difficult for your father and your uncle to understand, but I am leaving the bulk of my estate to you, because I see in you the same qualities that made your grandfather successful in business. You think carefully before you act. You save money rather than spend impulsively. Most importantly, you understand that money is a tool to build a good life, not the definition of a good life itself." My voice caught slightly as I continued reading. "I have watched your father struggle with money his entire adult life, not because he is a bad person, but because he sees money as something to spend rather than something to invest. Your brother is brilliant, but he believes that his education entitles him to a lifestyle he has not yet earned. You, my dear grandson, understand the difference between wants and needs. You will use this money wisely, and when the time comes you will help your family in ways that teach them rather than simply enable them." The courtroom was completely silent. My mother was crying now, but not the sympathetic tears she had shed earlier. These were tears of recognition and perhaps shame. "Your Honor, my grandmother was not trying to punish her children. She was trying to teach them. And part of that lesson was ensuring that the person who inherited her wealth would be someone who understood its true value." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in my folder. The conservatorship petition before this court today is not about protecting me from my own poor judgment. It is about my family's attempt to circumvent my grandmother's final wishes because they are facing financial difficulties of their own making. I submit that my recent financial struggles, while real, are the result of my decision to invest in my future by studying law rather than taking temporary employment. These struggles are temporary and strategic, not indicative of long-term poor judgment. I returned to my seat but remained standing. I am prepared to present witnesses who will testify to my character and to my family's true motivations in bringing this petition. I am also prepared to demonstrate that not only am I capable of managing my inheritance responsibly, but that I have already been managing it more responsibly than my own family has been managing their finances. Judge Hendricks made notes on her pad before looking up. "Mr. Richardson, you may call your first witness." I had laid the foundation for my defense, but the hardest part was yet to come. My family was about to put people on the stand to testify against me, and I would have to cross-examine each of them knowing that every question I asked would drive a deeper wedge between me and the people I had once trusted most. Richardson's first witness was my former supervisor at Williams & Associates, Janet Murphy. She was a stern woman in her early 50s, wearing a conservative gray suit and an expression that suggested she would rather be anywhere else. "Miss Murphy," Richardson began, "you were Joseph Anderson's direct supervisor for 3 years, at that correct?" "Yes, that's correct." "Can you describe his performance during his employment?" Janet's testimony was devastating. She described me as frequently distracted, argumentative with colleagues, and ultimately unreliable. According to her account, I had been terminated for insubordination and failure to complete assignments on time. He seemed to believe that his opinions mattered more than established procedures, she said, avoiding eye contact with me. On multiple occasions, he questioned senior partners' decisions in front of clients, which created an uncomfortable working environment. When Richardson finished his questioning, I stood to cross-examine her. This was the moment I had been dreading most. Janet had been my mentor when I first started at the firm, and I had genuinely respected her opinion. "Ms. Murphy, you testified that I was terminated for insubordination. Can you specifically describe the incident that led to my termination?" She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "You were asked to finalize the Henderson Industries account reconciliation, and instead of completing the work, you spent your time reviewing other client files without authorization. And what did I find when I reviewed those other client files?" "Objection," Richardson interrupted. "Relevance." Judge Hendricks overruled the objection. "The witness may answer." Janet looked directly at me for the first time since taking the stand. There was something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Guilt, perhaps. "You found discrepancies in billing records." "What kind of discrepancies?" "Hours that had been billed to clients for work that was never performed." "And when I brought these discrepancies to your attention, what did you advise me to do?" There was a long pause. "I advised you to focus on your own assignments." "But I didn't follow that advice, did I?" "No." "What did I do instead?" Another long pause. "You compiled a detailed report of the billing irregularities and submitted it to the State Board of Accountancy." The courtroom was completely silent. Richardson was furiously taking notes, clearly realizing that his witness was not providing the testimony he had expected. "Ms. Murphy, were the billing irregularities I discovered legitimate concerns?" She looked down at her hands. "The State Board is still investigating." "And I was terminated 3 days after filing that report, correct?" "Yes." "In your professional opinion, Ms. Murphy, was my termination related to my whistleblower complaint?" Richardson jumped to his feet. "Objection calls for speculation." "Your Honor," I said, "Ms. Murphy was my direct supervisor and was present at the meeting where my termination was decided. She has personal knowledge of the circumstances." Judge Hendricks allowed the question. Janet took a deep breath before answering. "In my opinion, yes. The partners were concerned about potential liability from your allegations." I could hear murmuring from the gallery behind me. This was not the testimony my family had been expecting. "One final question, Ms. Murphy. During my 3 years at Williams & Associates, prior to discovering these billing irregularities, was I a competent employee?" "Yes," she said quietly. "You were one of our most thorough and honest employees." When Janet stepped down, Richardson called his second witness Robert Chen, a longtime family friend who owned a small electronics store in our neighborhood. Robert's testimony focused on my allegedly frivolous spending habits. He described seeing me purchase expensive electronics and dining at restaurants above my means. Just last month, Robert testified, I saw Joe at Best Buy purchasing a PlayStation 5 gaming console. This was shortly after his mother told me he had asked for money to pay his electric bill. When my turn came to cross-examine Robert, I felt a familiar pang of betrayal. Robert had been like a second father to me, growing up always available with advice and support. Mr. Chen, you testified that you saw me purchase a gaming console at Best Buy. Were you in the store to make a purchase yourself? Yes, I was buying supplies for my store. And you spoke with me during that visit? Yes, briefly. Do you recall what I told you about the gaming console purchase? Robert shifted uncomfortably. You said something about it being a gift. A gift for whom? He hesitated. Your nephew. My brother Marcus's son, correct, 7-year-old Tommy. Yes. And do you remember what occasion I mentioned? Another hesitation. His birthday. So the gaming console you described as evidence of my frivolous spending was actually a birthday gift for my 7-year-old nephew. Well, yes, but... Mr. Chen, before testifying here today, did anyone from my family ask you to emphasize certain aspects of your observations while omitting others? Robert looked desperately toward my parents. I don't understand the question. Let me be more specific. Did my mother or father ask you to mention seeing me make that purchase, but to avoid mentioning that it was a birthday gift for my nephew? The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Robert answered. Linda asked me to testify about your spending habits. She said it would help the family. And did she specifically ask you to describe the PlayStation purchase without mentioning it was a gift? She said I should keep my testimony simple and not complicate things with extra details. I could see my mother's face reddening from the corner of my eye. Mr. Chen, in your opinion, is purchasing a birthday gift for a 7-year-old nephew, evidence of financial irresponsibility. No, he said quietly. I suppose it's not. After Robert stepped down, I called my surprise witness. The bailiff opened the courtroom door and Helen Foster walked in. She was my grandmother's financial advisor for over 20 years, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect. Richardson immediately objected to her testimony as irrelevant, but Judge Hendricks allowed me to proceed. Ms. Foster, you managed my grandmother's financial affairs for 2 decades. Were you involved in the creation of her will and the trust fund? Yes, I helped her structure the trust and advised her on the beneficiary designation. Can you tell the court why she chose to leave the bulk of her estate to me rather than to her children? Helen smiled slightly. Sarah Anderson was a very wise woman. She told me that her son David was generous to a fault, but had never learned to distinguish between helping people and enabling them. She said that Marcus was brilliant, but believed that intelligence alone entitled him to wealth. She chose you because you had shown her that you understood money was a responsibility, not just an opportunity. Can you give the court a specific example? When you were 16, your grandmother gave you $500 for Christmas. Instead of spending it, you asked her to help you open a savings account. By the time you graduated high school, you had saved over $3,000 from part-time jobs and gifts. Your grandmother used to tell me that you were the only person in the family who seemed to understand that money saved today was freedom earned tomorrow. I could feel the atmosphere in the courtroom shifting. Even Judge Hendricks seemed moved by this testimony. Miss Foster, are you aware that my family is facing financial difficulties? Yes, David came to me last year asking for advice about his restaurant. I reviewed his books and recommended that he consider selling the business and finding employment rather than continuing to lose money. Did he follow that advice? No, instead, he asked me if there was any way to access Joe's trust fund early to invest in the restaurant. The courtroom erupted in whispers. My father was shaking his head vigorously, but the damage was done. What did you tell him? I explained that the trust was specifically structured to prevent exactly that kind of misuse. Sarah had seen her son struggle with money throughout his adult life, and she wanted to ensure that her grandson would not bail him out of every financial crisis. One final question. Miss Foster, despite being unemployed for 6 months, am I behind on any legitimate financial obligations related to my grandmother's estate or other family responsibilities? Helen reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. Actually, Joe, I have records here showing that for the past year, you have been making payments on your parents' mortgage using your personal savings. Even after losing your job, you continued making those payments until your savings were exhausted 3 months ago. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. I could hear my mother's quiet sobs from the front row. You've been secretly paying our mortgage? Judge Hendricks asked. Yes, Your Honor. When my father's restaurant started failing, I used my savings to ensure my parents wouldn't lose their home. They never asked me to do this, and I never told them I was doing it. I simply made the payments directly to the bank. I turned to look at my family for the first time since the hearing began. My father was staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was shame. The most damaging testimony of the day had come from my own witnesses revealing truths that my family had never intended for this courtroom to hear. But I knew the hardest part was still ahead. I still had one more piece of evidence to present, and it would change everything. Judge Hendricks called for a brief recess, and as the courtroom emptied, I remained at my table organizing my final folder. This contained the evidence I had hoped I would never need to use, but my family's willingness to lie under oath had forced my hand. When court resumed, Richardson looked confident as he prepared for his closing argument. He clearly believed that despite the unexpected revelations, he still had enough evidence of my financial irresponsibility to convince the judge. Your Honor, I said, standing before Richardson could begin, I have one final piece of evidence to present to the court. I opened my third folder and pulled out my phone and a small recording device. 3 weeks ago, my family held what they called an emergency meeting at my parents' house to discuss this conservatorship petition. I had left my phone charging in the kitchen when I arrived, and it remained there throughout their discussion. Unbeknownst to me at the time, my phone automatically began recording when it received a call that went to voicemail. Richardson was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Any such recording would have been made without consent and would be inadmissible. Your Honor. I replied, Pennsylvania is a one-party consent state for recordings. Additionally, this recording was made accidentally, and the conversation took place in my presence. The phone was in plain sight, and the recording function activated automatically due to an incoming call. Judge Hendricks considered this carefully. I'll allow the evidence, but I reserve the right to rule on its admissibility after hearing the content. I connected my phone to the courtroom's audio system and played the recording. My mother's voice filled the room clear and unmistakable. The key is to make Joe look as irresponsible as possible. We need to emphasize every mistake he's made, every bill he's been late on, every time he's needed help. My father's voice followed, what if he fights this? What if he actually shows up with a lawyer? Then Marcus's voice, cold and calculating, he won't. He can't afford a real attorney, and he's too proud to ask for a public defender for a civil matter. Even if he tries to represent himself, he doesn't know anything about law. My mother again. Richardson says we need to show a pattern of poor judgment going back years. Robert agreed to testify about seeing Joe make frivolous purchases. Janet will testify about his work problems. Richardson's voice could be heard in the background. The key is to avoid mentioning the clause about the money going to charity if the conservatorship fails. We also need to be careful not to reveal your own financial situations. If the judge realizes this is about your debts rather than Joe's competence, we'll lose. My father. What if Joe mentions that he's been helping with our mortgage? Marcus, he won't. He's too embarrassed about being unemployed to admit he was using his savings to help us. Besides, that actually works in our favor. It shows he makes emotional financial decisions instead of logical ones. There was laughter in the background, and then my mother's voice again. The important thing is that we all stick to the same story. Joe has always been irresponsible with money. We're only trying to protect him from himself. Richardson's voice. I need you to understand that if this works, you'll have complete control over the trust fund. Joe will receive an allowance for basic needs, but all major financial decisions will go through David as conservator. However, if anyone discovers that this is really about your restaurant debt or Marcus's student loans, the judge could decide that Joe is actually the most financially responsible person in the family. Marcus, what are the chances Joe could actually become competent enough to manage the money on his own? Richardson, honestly, if he stays unemployed and keeps accumulating debt, we can probably extend the conservatorship indefinitely. We might even be able to argue for a permanent arrangement if we can demonstrate ongoing mental or emotional instability. My father, mental instability. Richardson, depression from unemployment anxiety about his financial situation, possible substance abuse. These are all angles we could explore if the initial conservatorship petition succeeds. The recording continued for several more minutes with my family and their attorney discussing strategies to manipulate evidence, coach witnesses, and potentially expand the conservatorship beyond financial matters. When the recording ended, the courtroom was completely silent. Judge Hendricks was staring at Richardson with an expression of barely contained fury. Mr. Richardson, do you care to explain what I just heard? Richardson was sweating profusely. Your Honor, that recording was taken out of context. My clients were simply discussing legitimate legal strategies. Legitimate legal strategies. Judge Hendricks' voice was rising. You discussed coaching witnesses to provide misleading testimony, hiding relevant financial information from the court, and potentially pursuing false claims of mental instability. I stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, this recording reveals that this entire conservatorship petition is a fraud. My family is not concerned about my financial well-being. They are concerned about their own financial survival, and they believe that gaining control of my inheritance is their solution. I pulled out additional documents from my folder. These are copies of loan applications my father filed with 3 different banks over the past 6 months, all of which were denied due to his existing debt load. These are credit card statements showing that my mother has maxed out 4 different cards trying to keep my father's restaurant afloat. And these are student loan documents showing that my brother owes more in educational debt than most people earn in a year. Judge Hendricks examined each document carefully. Your Honor, the irony of this situation is that while my family was gathering evidence of my financial irresponsibility, they were engaging in exactly the kind of behavior that my grandmother was trying to prevent when she structured her will. They have borrowed beyond their means, made poor business decisions, and now they want to use my inheritance to solve problems of their own making. I turned to face my family directly. The saddest part is that if they had simply asked for help, I would have given it freely. Even now, despite everything that has happened in this courtroom, I am prepared to help them address their legitimate financial needs. But not by surrendering control of my grandmother's trust to people who have proven they cannot manage their own money responsibly. Richardson stood shakily. Your Honor, I move to withdraw from this case. Motion denied. Judge Hendricks replied sharply. You open this case, Mr. Richardson, and you will see it through to its conclusion. We will take a 30-minute recess during which time I will review all evidence presented. When we return, I will render my decision. As the courtroom emptied, I sat alone at my table, emotionally drained, but somehow relieved. The truth was finally out. Whatever happened next, at least there were no more secrets between my family and me. But I knew that winning this case was only the beginning. The real challenge would be figuring out how to rebuild relationships that had been shattered by months of deception and betrayal. When court resumed, Judge Hendricks wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. Before I render my decision on the conservatorship petition, I want to hear directly from the petitioners about the evidence that has been presented today. Mr. David Anderson, please take the stand. My father walked slowly to the witness stand, looking older than I had ever seen him. Judge Hendricks did not ask him to swear in, since this was not formal testimony, but rather an opportunity for explanation. Mr. Anderson, I have heard a recording in which you and your family discussed manipulating evidence and coaching witnesses for this proceeding. I have also seen financial documents indicating that your family is facing significant debts while seeking control over your son's inheritance. I want you to explain to this court in your own words what is really happening here. My father sat in silence for almost a full minute, his hands trembling slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Your Honor, everything Joe said is true. We're broke. The restaurant has been failing for over a year, and I've been too proud to admit it. Linda and I have borrowed against everything we own, and we're still falling behind every month. Judge Hendricks leaned forward. And you believed that gaining control of your son's trust fund would solve these problems. I didn't think of it as Joe's money, my father said, tears starting to form in his eyes. It came from my mother. She worked her whole life to build that wealth. And when she died, I felt like she had chosen Joe over her own children. I convinced myself that we deserved some of that money because we were her family too. But Mr. Anderson, your mother made a conscious choice to leave that money to your son. Did you consider that she might have had good reasons for that decision? My father looked across the courtroom at me for the first time since taking the stand. I didn't want to consider it, Your Honor. It was easier to believe that Joe was irresponsible than to admit that maybe my mother didn't trust me with money. And I was right not to trust myself. I've made nothing but bad decisions for 2 years. Judge Hendricks made notes as my father continued. The worst part is that Joe has been helping us without us even knowing it. While we were plotting to take his inheritance, he was using his own savings to pay our mortgage. What kind of father accepts help from his unemployed son and then tries to steal his future? When my father stepped down, Judge Hendricks called my mother to the stand. Mrs. Anderson, do you have anything to add to your husband's testimony? My mother was crying before she even reached the witness box. Your Honor, I knew this was wrong from the beginning, but I was scared. David's restaurant was everything to him, and when it started failing, he became so depressed that I was afraid he might hurt himself. When Richardson suggested the conservatorship, it felt like a lifeline. Did you believe your son was actually incapable of managing his inheritance? No, my mother said through her tears. Joe has always been the most responsible person in our family. Even as a child, he saved his allowance while Marcus and his cousins spent theirs immediately. I knew he would handle the money better than any of us. Then why did you support this petition? Because I was desperate, and I let desperation make me do something terrible. I convinced myself that Joe would understand eventually that family was more important than money. But I was wrong. Families should protect each other, not steal from each other. When my mother stepped down, Judge Hendricks called Marcus to the stand. Mr. Anderson, you are an attorney yourself. You understand the ethical implications of what has occurred here today. What do you have to say for yourself? Marcus looked like he had aged 10 years since the hearing began. His expensive suit now seemed like a costume that no longer fit properly. Your Honor, I want to start by apologizing to this court and to my brother for my role in this deception. I knew better, and I did it anyway. Why? Because I was drowning in debt, and I was too ashamed to ask for help. Law school cost me over $150,000, and my salary at Henderson Clark barely covers my student loan payments and basic living expenses. When my parents suggested this conservatorship, I saw it as a way to solve everyone's problems at once. Did you believe your brother was incapable of managing his inheritance? Absolutely not. Joe is smarter than I am about money. He always has been. I spent years accumulating debt to pay for a law degree while he taught himself enough law to pass the bar exam without owing a penny to anyone. If anyone in this family should be managing a large inheritance, it's Joe. Then why did you participate in this fraudulent petition? Marcus looked directly at me, and I could see genuine remorse in his eyes. Because I was jealous. I worked so hard in school, graduated at the top of my law class, got a job at a prestigious firm, and I'm still struggling financially. Meanwhile, Joe gets fired from his job and somehow turns it into an opportunity to become an attorney. I wanted to believe that he didn't deserve his inheritance because accepting that he did deserve it meant accepting that I had made poor choices with my own life. Judge Hendricks made more notes before addressing the courtroom as a whole. This case has revealed a level of family dysfunction that is both deeply troubling and, unfortunately, all too common. Money has the power to bring out the best and worst in people, and today we have seen both. She turned her attention to me. Mr. Anderson, your family has admitted to lying to this court, manipulating evidence, and coaching witnesses. They have confessed that this conservatorship petition was filed in bad faith, motivated by their own financial desperation rather than concern for your welfare. Under normal circumstances, I would hold them in contempt of court and refer this matter to the district attorney for potential fraud charges. My heart was pounding as I waited for her next words. However, before I proceed with my ruling, I want to give you an opportunity to address the court. What would you like to see happen here? I stood slowly, knowing that my next words would determine not just my legal future, but the future of my relationships with my family. Your Honor, my family lied to this court, and they betrayed my trust in ways that I'm still trying to understand. But they are still my family, and I don't believe that their desperation justifies destroying their lives. I turned to face my parents and brother. I don't want criminal charges filed against them. I don't want to see my father lose his restaurant or my parents lose their home. I don't want my brother's legal career destroyed because of a mistake made in a moment of panic. I turned back to Judge Hendricks. What I want, Your Honor, is the opportunity to help my family in the way my grandmother intended when she left me this inheritance. Not by enabling their poor financial decisions, but by providing them with the resources and guidance they need to get back on their feet. Judge Hendricks raised her eyebrows. Can you be more specific? I pulled out a document I had prepared weeks ago, hoping I would never need to use it. I've prepared a detailed family financial assistance plan. If this court grants me full control over my trust fund, I propose to establish a structured loan program for my family members. My parents would receive enough money to pay off their immediate debts and keep their home, but the funds would be distributed gradually as they demonstrate progress in financial counseling and business planning. I looked at Marcus. My brother would receive assistance with his student loans, but only in conjunction with a plan to build his own legal practice or find employment that allows him to live within his means. Judge Hendricks was studying my proposal with interest. You're willing to help the same family members who just tried to steal your inheritance? Yes, Your Honor, because that's what family does. We help each other even when we've been hurt, especially when we've been hurt. The courtroom was completely silent. I could see my mother crying again, but these tears looked different than before. They looked like tears of relief rather than despair. Your Honor, I believe my grandmother left me this inheritance not just because she trusted me with money, but because she trusted me to do the right thing for our family when the time came. Today is that time." Judge Hendricks set down her pen and looked at each member of my family before addressing the court. "I have been a family court judge for over 20 years, and I have rarely seen a case that has moved from fraud and deception to forgiveness and healing in the course of a single day. Mr. Anderson, your proposal is both generous and wise." She paused for a moment, organizing her thoughts. "This court will deny the conservatorship petition in its entirety. Mr. Joseph Anderson will maintain full control over his inheritance. However, I want to see a detailed implementation plan for your family assistance program within 30 days. Relief flooded through me, but Judge Hendricks was not finished. "Mr. Richardson, you will be reported to the State Bar Association for your role in this fraudulent petition. Your conduct today has been a disgrace to the legal profession." She turned her attention to my family. "As for the rest of you, you are fortunate that your son and brother is a better person than you deserved today. I suggest you spend some time reflecting on that fact." Judge Hendricks stood and gathered her papers. "This court is adjourned." As the gavel fell, I felt a mixture of triumph and sadness. I had won my inheritance, but the cost had been the trust and respect of my family. The real work of rebuilding those relationships was just beginning. The courthouse hallway felt like neutral ground, as my family and I stood awkwardly together for the first time since the hearing began. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, and the formal setting somehow made our personal crisis feel even more surreal. My parents looked shell-shocked, as if they were still processing what had just happened. Marcus was leaning against the wall staring at his phone, probably calculating how much this disaster might cost him professionally. I could have walked away. Part of me wanted to. The betrayal was fresh and deep, and I had every right to cut them out of my life completely. Instead, I found myself walking toward them. "Can we talk?" I asked quietly. My father looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "Joe, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to apologize for what we tried to do to you." "Start with the truth," I said. "All of it. No more secrets, no more manipulation. Just tell me what's really been happening." My mother stepped forward, and for the first time in months, she looked me directly in the eyes. "Your father's restaurant has been losing money for 18 months. We've borrowed against the house twice, maxed out our credit cards, and we're still 3 months behind on almost every bill. David has been working 16-hour days trying to save the business, but it's just not working." My father's voice was barely audible. "I fired 2 employees last month because I couldn't afford to pay them. Mrs. Chen, who's worked for us for 12 years, offered to work for free just to help us stay open. I was too proud to accept her offer and too proud to admit to you that everything was falling apart." Marcus pushed himself off the wall and joined our circle. "And I've been paying $800 a month in student loan payments for 3 years, which means I'm living paycheck to paycheck despite having a law degree. I've been turned down for every apartment I've applied for because my debt-to-income ratio is too high. I'm 29 years old, and I'm still living in the same studio apartment I rented in law school." I listened to each confession, feeling my anger slowly transform into something more complex. These were not evil people. They were desperate people who had made terrible choices. "Why didn't any of you just ask me for help?" My mother's voice broke as she answered. "Because you were struggling too. You lost your job. You were having trouble paying your own bills. How could we ask our unemployed son to solve our problems?" "But I was helping," I said. "I was paying your mortgage without you even knowing about it." My father shook his head in disbelief. "How could you afford that you were unemployed?" "I liquidated my retirement account. I sold my car and bought a cheaper one. I moved to a smaller apartment. I did what families do for each other. The silence that followed was heavy with regret and recognition. "Joe," Marcus said finally, "what you did in that courtroom today offering to help us, after everything we put you through, I don't understand it. If someone had tried to steal my inheritance, I would have destroyed them. That's the difference between you and me," I said not unkindly. "You see money as something to accumulate. I see it as something to use for the people I care about." I pulled out the family assistance plan I had mentioned to Judge Hendricks. "I've been working on this for weeks, hoping I would never need to use it. But now, I think it might be exactly what we all need." I spread the document out on a bench where we could all see it. "Here's what I'm proposing. Dad, you get a loan of $75,000 to pay off your immediate debts and restructure the restaurant. But the money comes with conditions. You work with a business consultant to develop a sustainable operating plan. You take a small business management course. And you agree to regular financial check-ins with me." My father was staring at the numbers with an expression of disbelief. "Mom, you get access to financial counseling and debt management services. Your credit cards get paid off, but they also get closed until you complete a year of financial education classes." I turned to Marcus. "And you get help with your student loans, but only if you agree to move back home for a year to save money and work with me to build a financial plan that actually makes sense for your income level." Marcus looked embarrassed. "Move back home? I'm almost 30 years old." "And you're almost 30 years old with no savings, no assets, and enough debt to buy a house. Pride is what got all of us into this mess. Maybe it's time to set pride aside and focus on solutions." My mother was crying again, but these were different tears. "Joe, why would you do this for us, after what we tried to do to you?" I thought about my grandmother's letter about her wisdom in understanding that money should strengthen families rather than tear them apart. "Because you're my family, and because Grandma Sarah was right. The money isn't really mine, it's just in my care. My job is to use it in ways that make our family stronger, not ways that make me feel powerful." When we returned to the courtroom, Judge Hendricks looked surprised to see us all together. "Mr. Anderson, you requested additional time to present your family assistance plan. Are you ready to proceed?" "Yes, Your Honor. But first, I want to ask the court's permission to modify my original proposal." Judge Hendricks looked intrigued. "In what way?" "I want to establish a formal family trust with oversight from this court. Instead of simply loaning money to my family members, I want to create a structure that ensures accountability while providing genuine assistance." I handed copies of my revised plan to the judge and to the court reporter. This trust would provide financial assistance for legitimate needs like debt relief, education, and business stabilization. But it would also require participation in financial counseling, regular progress reports, and adherence to budgets developed with professional guidance. Judge Hendricks reviewed the document carefully. "Mr. Anderson, this is quite sophisticated. Did you develop this plan yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor. During my legal studies, I spent considerable time researching family trust structures and estate planning. I believe this approach will help my family without enabling the behaviors that created their current problems." Judge Hendricks looked at my family members who were all nodding their agreement. "Are you all willing to participate in this trust structure with its requirements for financial counseling and oversight?" My father stood. "Your Honor, after what happened here today, I think we all need guidance on how to handle money responsibly. If Joe is willing to help us despite our betrayal, the least we can do is commit to real change." My mother and Marcus both voiced their agreement. Judge Hendricks made notes for several minutes before looking up. "Very well. I will approve the establishment of the Anderson Family Trust with quarterly reporting requirements to this court. Mr. Anderson, I want to see detailed financial reports every 3 months for the first year demonstrating how the trust funds are being used and what progress your family members are making toward financial stability. She paused and looked at each of us in turn. I want to emphasize that this is an unusual arrangement. Most inheritance disputes end with damaged relationships and ongoing resentment. What I'm seeing here today gives me hope that families can heal even after serious betrayals, but only when all parties are committed to honesty and genuine change. As we left the courthouse together for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: hope for my family's future. The legal battle was over, but the real work of rebuilding trust and creating healthy financial habits was just beginning. For the first time since this whole ordeal started, I was looking forward to that challenge. 3 months after the courthouse drama that changed everything, I was sitting in my new office reviewing quarterly trust reports when my assistant knocked on the door. "Joe, your first appointment is here, the Morrison family." I looked up from the financial documents spread across my desk and smiled. 6 months ago, I was unemployed and struggling to pay my electric bill. Today, I was running Anderson Family Law, a practice specializing in estate planning and family financial disputes. The Morrison family reminded me of my own family just a few months earlier. John Morrison had been trying to gain control of his father's estate, claiming his sister was mismanaging their inheritance. Sarah Morrison sat across from her brother, their relationship clearly strained by money and mistrust. Let me start by telling you about a case I handled recently. I began settling into my chair. It involved a family that almost destroyed themselves fighting over an inheritance. As I shared my own story, I watched the Morrison siblings gradually realize that their conflict wasn't really about money at all. It was about feeling valued, feeling heard, and feeling like they mattered to their family. The question you need to ask yourselves, I told them, is whether winning this fight is worth losing each other. By the end of our 2-hour session, John and Sarah Morrison were talking to each other instead of at each other, and we had outlined a mediation process that would address both their financial concerns and their relationship issues. After they left, I drove across town to check on Anderson's family diner. The lunch rush was in full swing, and for the first time in 2 years, every table was occupied. My father spotted me from behind the counter and waved me over, his face beaming with the kind of pride I hadn't seen since I was a child. "Joe, look at this place. We just hired back Mrs. Chen and we're thinking about expanding the seating area." The restaurant transformation had been remarkable. With the trust fund loan, my parents had been able to pay off their immediate debts, upgrade their kitchen equipment, and implement the business plan developed with their consultant. More importantly, they had completed a small business management course and were working with a financial advisor to ensure they never found themselves in crisis mode again. "How are the finances looking?" I asked, reviewing the daily sales report. "We're actually ahead of projections for the month," my mother said, joining us with a stack of receipts. "The debt consolidation plan is working, and we're saving money every week now instead of spending more than we earn." I sat down with them for a few minutes to review their progress. They had paid back nearly $8,000 of their trust fund loan already ahead of schedule. More importantly, they seemed happier and more relaxed than they had been in years. "Joe," my father said, as I prepared to leave, "I want you to know that getting caught trying to steal your inheritance was the best thing that ever happened to this family." I raised my eyebrows. "How do you figure that?" "Because it forced us to tell the truth about our problems instead of pretending everything was fine. And it showed us that we raised a son who understands what family really means." My next stop was the small law office building where Marcus had recently hung out his own shingle. Anderson and Anderson Family Law Associates read the sign on the door. Inside, Marcus was meeting with a client, but he gestured for me to wait in his office. The transformation in my brother was as dramatic as the change in my parents. Living back home for the past 3 months had allowed him to save over $4,000, which he had used to start his own practice. The trust fund was helping him pay down his student loans aggressively, And for the first time since law school, he was building a financial cushion instead of living paycheck to paycheck. "How's the new practice going?" I asked when his client left. "Better than I expected. Word is getting out that we actually care about keeping families together instead of just winning cases. I've got 3 new clients this week, all referrals from people you've helped." Marcus pulled out a folder thick with financial documents. "I wanted to show you something. I've been working with the financial advisor you recommended, and I think I can have my student loans paid off completely within 2 years instead of the original 10-year timeline." I reviewed his budget and debt reduction plan. It was aggressive but realistic, and it showed a level of financial discipline that Marcus had never demonstrated before. "I'm proud of you," I told him, and I meant it. "Joe, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth." "Okay. Do you ever regret not walking away from us after what we did? You could have taken your inheritance and started a new life without the complications of dealing with our problems." I thought about his question seriously before answering. "Marcus, 6 months ago I thought my life was falling apart. I was unemployed, I was behind on bills, and I felt like a failure. But that crisis forced me to figure out who I really wanted to be and what I actually cared about." I gestured around his office, then toward the window that offered a view of our father's restaurant. "Look what we've built together. You have your own law practice doing meaningful work. Mom and Dad have a restaurant that's actually profitable. I have a career that lets me help other families avoid the mistakes we almost made. We're all financially stable for the first time in years." I paused, thinking about everything that had led us to this point. But more importantly, we actually trust each other now. We talk about money openly instead of hiding our problems. We ask for help when we need it instead of pretending we're fine. We've learned to separate our worth as people from our bank account balances. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "When I was lying awake at night worried about money, I used to think that having enough money would solve all my problems. But the real problem was that I was too ashamed to admit I needed help. That evening, I drove to Evergreen Cemetery to visit my grandmother's grave. It had become a monthly ritual since the conservatorship hearing, a time to reflect on how I was honoring her memory with the choices I was making. The headstone was simple: Sarah Elizabeth Anderson, beloved mother and grandmother. I placed fresh flowers in the vase and sat on the small bench nearby. "Hi, Grandma. I wanted to tell you about the Morrison family I met today. They reminded me of us a few months ago fighting over money when what they really needed was to fight for each other." I pulled out the quarterly trust reports and spread them on my lap. The trust fund has grown by 12% since I took control of it. Dad and Marcus are both ahead of schedule on their loan repayments. Mom completed her financial literacy course with a perfect score. And I think I'm finally starting to understand what you meant when you wrote that money should be a tool for building a good life, not the definition of one. A gentle breeze rustled the oak trees surrounding the cemetery, and I felt a sense of peace that had been missing from my life for far too long. "I think you would be proud of what we've accomplished. Not just the financial stuff, but the way we've learned to be honest with each other about our struggles and our fears. We're not perfect, but we're genuine now in ways we never were before." As the sun began to set, I gathered up my papers and prepared to head home to my new apartment. It was modest but comfortable, and for the first time in my adult life I was living within my means while also building toward the future. "Thank you," I said to my grandmother's headstone, "for believing in me, for trusting me with this responsibility, and for teaching me that the best way to honor someone's memory is to use their gifts to make other people's lives better." Driving home, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The conservatorship hearing had been one of the most painful experiences of my life, but it had also been one of the most transformative. It had forced my family to confront truths we had been avoiding for years, and it had given us the opportunity to rebuild our relationships on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. The financial security was nice, but the real treasure was having a family that I could trust and depend on again. We had learned that love isn't just about supporting each other's dreams, but also about holding each other accountable when those dreams lead us astray. As I pulled into my driveway, I thought about all the families I wanted to help through my law practice, all the inheritance disputes that could be resolved through mediation and honest conversation rather than courtroom battles. My grandmother's gift had given me more than financial freedom. It had given me a purpose. The next morning, I would return to my office and continue the work of helping families navigate the complex relationship between money and love. I would review more trust fund reports, mediate more inheritance disputes, and hopefully prevent other families from experiencing the pain mine had endured. But tonight, I was simply grateful. Grateful for a grandmother who saw potential in me that I hadn't seen in myself. Grateful for a family that had learned to choose love over money, and grateful for the opportunity to use my experiences to make a positive difference in other people's lives. If someone had told me a year ago that being betrayed by my family would lead to the best period of my life, I would have thought they were crazy. But sometimes our greatest gifts come wrapped in our most difficult challenges, and sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who ultimately teach us the most about forgiveness, resilience, and what really matters in life. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where family and money created conflict? How do you think financial stress affects family relationships? And what steps can families take to prevent money from destroying their bonds? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Thank you for following along with my story. I hope it serves as a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to choose healing over hatred, understanding over anger, and love over resentment. Sometimes, the greatest victory isn't defeating our enemies but helping them become better versions of themselves. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more stories about overcoming family challenges, and share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the power of forgiveness and second chances. Your support means everything to me, and it helps ensure that more people can hear these important messages about family money and the courage to choose love even when it's difficult. Until next time, remember that the inheritance that matters most isn't the money we leave behind, but the relationships we build and the love we share along the way.